Our guest today is Matthew Ferrence. His book is called Appalachia North. You can get a copy today if you like. And he teaches creative writing. All these guys teach creative writing. Did you ever notice that? At Allegheny College, where he lives and writes at the confluence of the Rust Belt and Appalachia. He and his family divide their time between northwestern Pennsylvania and Prince Edward Island, Canada. Here is Matthew Ferrence.
Thanks for coming out today. Thanks to Sean and the Ohio Valley Public Library for all of this. And I love reading in West Virginia. I think I might love West Virginia more than I love Pennsylvania, even though, this is the right crowd to say that, but West Virginia has given me so much. I did graduate work at WVU, and it sort of unlocked my life as a writer that had kind of been dead. And then my first reading for this book was in Buchanan at West Virginia Wesleyan, and I'm really thrilled to be reading here in West Virginia again. And I kind of like the idea that there's a Pennsylvania boy reading in West Virginia in a library named after Ohio, right? That's sort of who we are. We don't know exactly what that is, but it's everything. So here we go. I'm glad we have about 4 hours, I've been told. So I'll read every page. And I'm going to be insufferable because I'm middle-aged and my eyes are bad, so I have to put the glasses on and off, but I refuse to get bifocals. Consider deeper history. The very geology that made Appalachia. Some 375 million years ago, the tectonic plates shifted and various continents and subcontinents smashed into each other with enough slow-driven force to instigate the Akkadian orogeny. This is the birth of a mountain range. The slow-gathered energies of tension squeezing rock together, slinging some up, tunneling others beneath, until a great ridge begins to rise from the flatness. The Appalachians were once mighty mountains, high and craggy and snow-capped and rivaling anything the younger Rockies boast. The Rockies are at most only 80 million years old, more or less fresh, and have not yet experienced the hundreds of millions of years of weather and wind and further tectonic events that have smoothed out the Appalachians. Years during which rock entrapped and overlapped organic matter, forming the valuable mineral resources we know as the industrial markers of our region. Coal and natural gas, and near where I live now in northwestern Pennsylvania, the oil deposits that spawned a world-changing commercial industry. The oil has long since played out, and the coal industry has followed its own cycles of boom and bust. In the part of Appalachia where I grew up, the big days of coal ended when I was a toddler. A few small companies still run, mostly non-union, small-scale underground operations and various strip mine enterprises that peel back the trees to scrape away the remaining coal. Even recent attention to the pockets of organic matter trapped in layers of black Marcellus shale formed early in the Akkadian orogeny as a byproduct of erosion, and that has dimmed. Bust is always following any sort of boom, that cycle as tidal as the ancient sea that gathered sediments in the Appalachian Basin. Appalachian strip mining itself can be described like this. About 300 million years ago in a geologic time called the Pennsylvanian period, the vegetative matter of life drifted slowly to the floor of the great former sea that lay where Appalachia now rests. It gathered, decayed, and began the long ride toward becoming the carbon-rich, burnable rock we call coal. Over time, more sediments drifted down atop it, layers of silt and sand that hardened to sandstone. Pressure hardened the rock and made the coal beneath. More or less around this geologic instant, the Appalachian Mountains were born and immediately began eroding. The soft sedimentary rock of those peaks became a thick layer of rock above the coal beds, forming the Appalachian Plateau, which small creeks began wearing away into the deep valleys that shape the topography of our region. That water also sometimes exposed the burnable rock, and humans started using it to cook meat and provide warmth. Then humans started digging small pits and tunnels by hand, and in places like western Pennsylvania, they realized that it would be cheaper to use the machines they'd come up with, mighty tractors, giant shovels, blades, and buckets. The point is, geology defines what the region would be for eons to come. First, the land was home. Next, the mountains were obstacles. Then they were conquered, offering a triumph narrative for America. And there was coal, gas, and the ripping of these things from the ground. For a long time, there had been people too, triangulated with geology and the energy trapped within it. Also for a long time, the people of our region have been defined within the context of the geology beneath us. I come to my own weird personal identity as an Appalachian, as a northern Appalachian, and as a northern Appalachian who grew up on a farm with a professor father and a demure and intellectual mother from the Midwest, and with a grandfather who dug anthracite in pit mines in eastern, not really Appalachian Pennsylvania. I grew up as a nerd and a farm boy, as a 4-H club president and a high school thespian, with close friends who were the children of other professors, but I was also friendly with the neighbor kids who spit tobacco juice into Mountain Dew bottles in the back of the school bus during our morning pickups. And hopefully remembered which bottle was which. I was a kid at home in both the back of that bus and the front of the classroom, comfortable with nerds and rednecks, on the farm and the stage, in school and in the woods. I should qualify equally at home, though, to indicate how I never felt fully part of either side of that implied dichotomy. I've always felt a little stuck, which is to say I've always felt rather Appalachian. My metaphors are mixed, which fits because Appalachia is itself an imaginary space. It is the region between north and south, east and west, past and future. And as it turns out, even the mountains of Appalachia are not generally mountains at all, but instead mostly a dissected plateau. In our home turf, the appearance of mountains has been acquired only through the erosion of the Allegheny Plateau, a high landmass that stretched westward from the peaks of the mountains that are no more. The mountains of my youth were actually cut out by the flowing water of streams, creeks, and rivers, and were not lifted to their lofty position. There had been an uplift long ago, but the landscape that makes me me was a feature of wear and use. It is old. It is worn, but not worn out. Maybe Adelaine Buckland's recognition of Victorian geology as a metaphor can work here, if only we can reset the way we value the things our rocks imply, define ourselves not just by the value of coal, but by the grandeur of erosion. We can recalibrate how our metaphors make the unknown better known. Just the same, my own nativity to Appalachia is troublesome. At least in the broad strokes we tend to think define the region. I was born here, but I was born in that swath of the Appalachian Regional Commission north of the Mason-Dixon line, which makes me a marginal Appalachian at best. I grew up without many of the expected markers, meaning little moonshine and fiddle and no mountain accent in a part of the state with a heavy industrial past to go along with our coal. Weird also that mine is a lack that I define through the absence of stereotype. Part of the longing I feel as a northern Appalachian is a longing for a shorthand, even a limiting shorthand that offers a quick definition. And the truth is, certain parts of Pennsylvania do carry accents similar in tone to what might be called mountain, gradations of Appalachian speech that are as difficult to delimit as anything else existing on a spectrum. The Whiskey Rebellion happened in western Pennsylvania, so rogue alcohol matters to our history, even if we lack the folklore of backwoods distilleries. Still, somehow everything feels different to me in northern Appalachia, more hollow and undefined, liminal. Worse than even these absences, my personal ancestry can't be traced back generations, another supposed qualifier for Appalachian identity. My father may technically be from Appalachia as far as the ARC is concerned, but his home turf is eastern Pennsylvania, on the other side of the state in a place that aligns more with the Amish and Philadelphia than with hillbillies. He grew up in a Pennsylvania Dutch community, not the Amish, that's a different thing, and had to shed that accent when he went to school because of linguistic bullying. He was poor, that's Appalachian at least, and his father dug coal, but he did it with a giant dragline shovel in open-pit anthracite mines, a far different cultural marker than subterranean soft-coal bituminous tunnel mining. My mother is from Gary, Indiana, with grandparents who emigrated from Poland, Her father was a postman, and her mother a school secretary with a savvy mind for investments. My mother, who went to a Catholic boarding school in South Bend and then a Catholic women's college in Chicago, remembers wearing long white gloves to go to town. This is a prim, proper, urbane sort of childhood that doesn't fit the idea of the Appalachian at all, and in fact is not. My mother is from the plains and prefers the flatlands of the Midwest to the hills of our Pennsylvania farm. She used to complain how fast the sun disappeared at night, how sunsets were less of a production than they were on the golden fields of the country's agricultural center. In Appalachia, the sun seems to just disappear like the extinguishing of a candle. Then there's me, the faux Appalachian, a northerner in fact, with parents born elsewhere and no mountain accent on which I'm often complimented. You don't talk like you're from Appalachia, more than a few people have told me. I have a PhD. I teach at a private college. I play lots of golf. These things disqualify me as a hillbilly, if not as Appalachian altogether. Ultimately, this is one of the chief problems of being Appalachian, that we're not afforded the capacity of multitudes. We aren't permitted to be Whitman-esque, and if we want to count, we have to take on the markers of the rustic ideal. Yet the rocks from which we take our name keep rolling from Georgia to Newfoundland, and the borders are drawn, not real. So there must be space for something. New definitions, at least. New directions. And so I come to this. The lead I have been burying for many pages in this book that is about Appalachia, yes, and particularly about northern Appalachia, but also defined wholly and completely and unavoidably by February 15th, 2016, a Monday morning, when I logged into our local hospital's internet patient portal, clicked on the latest report uploaded early that day, a radiologist's read from an MRI that had been ordered just in case. There, I first saw the words intensely enhancing mass, and the principal concern is that of a tiny meningioma. So this is a book about the moment I felt my life fall into the pit of my belly. I didn't know what meningioma meant at the time, but I was conversant enough in Latin suffixes to understand that very few words that end in oma are good. Just as enhancing mass isn't the label you want to have applied to anything in your body, let alone your brain. I remember the immediate stun of reading those words, of carrying my iPad to the kitchen where my wife was preparing breakfast for our two boys and showing her the report. The mix of confusion and immediate terror and forced "it will be fine," I'm sure that one or both of us uttered in some way. Soon I listened over the phone to my ophthalmologist refer to the lesion on the meningeal lining of my optic nerve and tried to answer his question about which Pittsburgh hospital system I prefer for the neurosurgical appointment he'd make for me as soon as we hung up. I was surprisingly calm on the telephone, learning about all of this with supernatural evenness that might be described as shock. This is the moment when the vague physical symptoms of my recent history got a name. When I found myself personally unhinged from the body I'd known, and when definitions of myself would change toward a life permanently defined as recovered or damaged or God knows what. I picked the Allegheny Health Network, for what it's worth, named after the river that cuts southward through the western half of the state and after the ancient plateau remnant of our Appalachian Mountains, and which was also the same hospital where my grandmother learned of her terminal lung cancer 20 years earlier. That commonality didn't strike me until my wife and I drove down for the first appointment, and I saw the fluted aluminum facade of the newer portions of the hospital, now old and disheveled. In some way, the metallic scallops of that facade echo the profile of the steep hillsides of Pittsburgh, the bulges and rolls also akin to the tiered recovery excavation I'd grown up seeing on mountainsides cut open to the great coal. I had remembered that aluminum as shiny, but in the gray late winter of 2016, I was startled by its dullness, by the grime that had accumulated on the surface. In the Appalachia of my birth, you drive often among hills carrying the unmistakable shape of strip mining reclamation. The contour lines are smoothed off such hills, the angles planed into more uniform grades than the typical eroded topography of this part of the country. There are Christmas trees planted alongside grass, pine, fir, and spruce, making a decent crop in soil that's too steep and depleted for much else. They call hills like this returned to contour, a legal requirement for the reclamation of land after strip mining. The idea is that the external signs of great gouging shovel work are removed. The term is a lie, intended to suggest that strip mining is a benign act, that the land can be returned to what it was before, that it hasn't been altered by the destructive forces of extractive moving. The land is dozed into the same rough shape it once had. Mathematically, I'm sure it works. You can measure the rise and run, and the new is the same as the old, but it isn't the same. And anyone looking at the hills can tell. Part of it is clear from the scrubby vegetative growth. The topsoil is gone, washed and trucked away, so millions of years of natural compost are gone too, along with the healthy nematodes, insects, and onward up through the chain of natural organisms. Walking these former hills would be an industrialized version of what Wendell Berry cites, of traversing Kentucky slopes as if knee-deep in the absence of original soil. In this fashion, a strip mine is reclaimed, considered to be restored and healed. When I consider the language of reclamation, I consider also the extent of need. In this context, reclamation strikes me as a violent term, even if it's the best we have. Reclamation implies a continued cycle of domination, very little change in the conditions of power that led to problems in the past. Indeed, such cycles are the unbroken history of Appalachia, where impaired relationships find new ways to hold on to old grudges. The landscape suffers always, even while it obstinately continues to exist. Instead of reclamation, I desire the wisdom of repair. That begins with the act of recognition, self-recognition most of all, since change that gestures only outward without settling first inward is doomed. And I recognize this. The new contour of reclaimed hills is awkward and jagged. Eons of geological uplift, natural erosion, gathered silt, and pathways of deer and people are raised, then dug through, then rebuilt with a dozer. The contour line is a best fit line. I mean this in the sense of math again. The natural chaos of erratic dots replaced by the smoothness of simplicity by what a human being could do in a week, in contrast to what an ecosystem can do in millions of lifetimes. I might also describe looking at reclaimed hills as akin to viewing an 8-bit video game version of the landscape. Everything pixelated and blocky without nuance. The technology wasn't there in those old video games of my childhood to make the scenery look real. That's a reclaimed mountain too. If there's a ledge, it's tiered, limited in our infinite landscape, just as if there were sprite problems and processing limitations. Such a rise is no longer a mountain, but we have no word for it, no new category to define the new thing that has been created. It fits our paradigm of a mountain, so we call it a mountain, pretending that what it was is what it has become again. But the past is irretrievable. We should all know that by now. Words are funny, and how we speak the world into existence is strange, imprecise, and ultimately not as useful or stable as we might think. I live another narrative problem now. More than a year after that quick return to Prince Edward Island, I took a trip to Prince Edward Island, I didn't tell you that. And, so you have to read the rest of the book. And more than a year after acute treatments for my brain tumor have finished, I have been treated, restored scientifically and medically, reclaimed, and offered a clean bill of health. I'm supposed to be the man who I was before all of this began, and this is now a problem I share with Reclaimed Appalachia. It has become clear to me that reclamation is a term that binds us to unrecoverable pasts. It supposes errantly the same notion as strip mine reclamation, that what was can be again. I have been returned to contour, cut open, a hatch of bone laid aside on a table, mined for bone and flesh to clear space for radiation-induced swelling, the hatch placed back with glue and titanium screws. A surgeon sewed my eyelid back together, that location serving as the portal to the shaft of my optic canal. I lay in a hospital, then lay at home, and I recovered. But things are not the same. Even though my surgeons have told me everything has been a rousing success, my vision is still compromised. The blind spot that first signaled my condition, unrecoverable. I'll never not have a blind spot in my left eye, never not be colorblind in that eye. And while the vision measures on machines is the same as before the surgery, which is to say it remains medically as poor as it was before we started, it is recognizably worse to me. When I exercise, the vision dims, as if someone is slowly turning a dial. When I drink beer, the vision dims too. I'm an Appalachian, I won't stop. When I play my saxophone, the notes on my music rapidly become illegible. One neurologist thinks this is a vascular issue. She ordered an MMR angiogram, which showed a kink in my ophthalmic nerve, a rerouting caused by the tumor, but no impact on blood flow. An ophthalmologist thinks the new blindness is akin to Utah's phenomenon, a condition present in individuals with multiple sclerosis, in which damaged nerves become unable to transmit information properly when they heat up. My neurosurgeon has no idea, so he sent me to a stroke neurologist. I waited 9 months for that appointment, only for this newest doctor in my collection to say more or less, there's no sign of a stroke, he told me. I do not mean to complain. No one likes a patient who complains. Worse still is someone recovered who complains about the chronic state of not being whole, or suffering pain, or otherwise reminding the world that things are not okay, that recovery is incomplete. Such people call attention to the falsity of narratives, which loosens our grip on the comfort of known or intended destination. Maybe we learn our carrying capacity as a way to see the cogs of society functioning, Sonia Huber writes. Maybe we hide the pain to preserve our own pride and autonomy. When a person confesses to being sick, she is seen as less reliable, less capable, and therefore less of a person within the social and production networks of the well. This is the affront of reclamation. The lies we tell and are told that we're fine, that we're back to our old selves, that life has become normal again. Life might be normal, but there is no again. The old self is gone, and the word fine carries different connotations. When I look upon my body, I am looking at the landscape of an undermined region, so I declare about myself the same thing I declare about so many spots in my Pennsylvania birthplace. This is not a mountain. 5 weeks after surgery, I drove myself back down I-79, across the threshold of my own recent despair and pain. I had recovered enough to enter the cancer center, bite into a paper towel to form a quick impression of my teeth, have technicians select a properly sized tray filled with a dark blue cock, bite into that for a gagging, drooling 5 minutes, wait for the new mouthguard to set, then lay down on a table with the new device inserted between my teeth. I was well enough to allow the technicians to attach my new mouthguard to an arm attached to a giant machine, everything clipped tight by wrenching, jarring levers that shot the force of connection through my teeth as a shock wave that reverberated in my skull. I was strong enough to be locked down by my teeth to a table, to wait while the techs stretched a warm piece of fiberglass over my eyes, it too locked tightly to a machine. I allowed all of this in order to create the apparatus that would secure my body 5 days a week for 6 weeks. This new brain of mine and this new blind superhero mask dotted with target marks intended to make sure I couldn't move and that the radiation hit where it was supposed to. I was thus calibrated and triangulated, The borders of my tumor known through MRIs and translated corporeally by a series of numbers that for each of 30 sessions the technicians I got to know would shout out as they adjusted the pitch and aspect of the table on which I lay, setting the beam. In the future that was then yet to come, I will drive each day, usually accompanied by one of many generous friends. A Versa HD proton accelerator will hit me with radiation from 7 angles, 6 around the latitude of my head, and 1 straight down through the top of my skull. Each location will develop a pimple, and each will develop a bald spot. But all in all, a nurse will tell me, I've never seen someone tolerate brain radiation so well. I will lay in the room among hanging racks of body pillows, each custom fit to a person, each representing a life in flux, each is someone's life. The array hanging is silent sentinel to treatment, brown raw fabric almost like burlap molded tight to a body. These objects create a strange clinical intimacy in this room. Each seems like a cradle around a precise, unique form, a reminder that this is also custom, each treatment carrying different coordinates on the machine, different dreams and fears and prognoses. Each is also a customized garment of restraint, an object intended to immobilize and force each of us to wait, still, maybe silent, and be treated. My treatment. I'm blind, alone, clamped to the machine by face and teeth. I listen to the machine whir around me. I smell it when it radiates, heated plastic and ionized air. Radiation, of course, has no smell, but there is an odor when it fires, and I will count 1 through 7, missing only 1 of the 210 shots in my aggregate personal count. Each day, certain blasts will light up my optic nerve, a flash of white light, sometimes an intense blue in the middle of my vision. I will listen to the Bee Gees sing "Stayin' Alive" during more than one of my sessions, a song in the official treatment room mix that strikes me as both hilarious and terrifying. I will realize that I have no evidence for the success of these treatments beyond light and smell, each of which signifies nothing in particular. I am helpless in treatment, will wait only for side effects as a peculiar welcome sign of effect. I will decide to trust the flashes of light in my eye, reversals of the blindness that led me to diagnosis, will consider all of this a kind of faith, or at least trust. Should I raise my voice in song, offer a canticle to ozone and protons and the company that built the machine, the technicians as acolytes, doctor as priest? I will await the release of my mask and mouth guard, leap from the table and wish goodbye to my technicians. I will return to my waiting friend, perhaps have lunch together, then drive home. Again. How then do we triangulate ourselves? How do we find the coordinates of ourselves, our regions, our sense of who and what and where we come from? Margins are in flux, coordinates rendered easily in the form of degrees, seconds, minutes, these terms also carrying the weight of multiplicity, and in the end agreed upon measurements that signify nothing beyond what we make of them. I am moved to find the corners of northern Appalachia, just as I am moved to contain my sense of recovery within the framework of moments. These desires are driven by falsity, clear enough on the ground of northern Appalachia. There is no difference between here and there. No stability to the line itself, only surfaces that have been worn, shaped, and wrought by the scraping away of so many glacial elements, real and imagined. What does not change is the rock, the substrate. No, it changes too, as rock is a process also. The compressed dust of a galactic Big Bang folded, cut, morphed, spewed, and laid.
Tracing geology lets me consider the constructions of borders between regions, subregions, nations, and concepts of identity, all of which roughen up the edges of what we think of when we say Appalachia. How far north can you go and still be in the region? How far east and west? How far inside myself am I still Appalachian? Scott Russell Sanders encourages deep embeddedness. We can lie to ourselves about many things, but if we lie about our relationship to the land will suffer, and soon we and all other creatures that share the land will suffer. We can lie also about our own coordinates, both in failing to see how our sense of who we are can be determined only in relation to things outside of ourselves, and in failing to understand how the things we think of as stable are nothing more real than the margin of the ARC beneath Buckeye Lake in Ohio, are no easier found than the invisible boundary between Maryland and Pennsylvania, are no more tangible than the demarcation between Rust Belt and Appalachia, are no more artificial than the line separating the United States from Canada. We are perhaps all tiny glacial erratics, shards who wind up in both unexpected and inevitable places. I think of this also, that a brain tumor is not external. It is a part of me, grew from me, is made up of the same substances that I am. Yet the outcome of having had a brain tumor, that difficult reckoning of how you move through life after finding one, is to feel a deep and profound separation of yourself from yourself. Like all people, we perceive the version of reality that our culture communicates, Gloria Enzeldua writes. Like others having or living in more than one culture, we get multiple, often opposing messages. The coming together of two self-consistent but habitually incomparable frames of reference causes un choc, a cultural collision. Healthy and awake, dreaming and awake, Appalachian and northern, dead and alive, asleep and awake, Appalachian and Appalachian, the recognition of particular places near other particular places, each alike and dissimilar, real and imagined, flat and steep, eroded and uplifted, the shock of considering a life defined by pre and post, staying and going, both somehow. Only by understanding where I live can I learn how to live, Sanders writes. Instead of redrawing the same old lines, thinking about how the ARC and Appalachia must always be a virulent circle around the worst of poverty, containing that horror within the mountains, we can start thinking about better, more useful, more accurate ways to start to delineate. No, let me correct myself. We can't delineate, because lines are the root of the problem. Lines say here and there, yours and mine, one way and different. That's just it. The lines aren't really clear at all. There's no reclamation. I return to that because reclamation is as philosophically problematic as cartography. Someone has to decide what to reclaim to, and the risk is that grading a mountain to make way for development could be indeed a reclamation, a claim renewed, the surrounding principles of exploitative culture carving rocks as it sees value. That's reclamation at heart, the building of pixelated mountains or fresh flats ready for shopping malls. Real recovery is a more fundamental recognition, longer to establish and commit to, harder to do, and it requires that you decide what you really are at core. In Appalachia, the nation has decided that our core is extractive industry, that the relationship to geology, to our actual substrate, is one of profit and removal. That's a bad relationship, one always fraught and ready to collapse. That's a relationship defined only by its very end. There can be no reclamation when you destroy your substance. Thus I discard that core, recognizing instead that the not mountains of Appalachia are my bedrock, that erosion is just another way to shape stone into sculpture. My geology matters, makes me who I am, and I commit myself to reconciling with a relationship delivered to me already broken. The rocks forgive. The rocks remain. My way of looking at them and at myself may be unsettled, but it is at the very least ready. We all carry scars. I have many from childhood falls, and they grow with me. I carry a bald streak in the front of my hairline from when I hit my head on that electric meter outside of John's house in 3rd grade. His mother, the nurse, their white porcelain sink splashed red as I bled, freshly scarred forever. Then there's the divot on my knee when I wrecked my bike, and when later that night I awoke to see the terrifying omen of a bat flying around the ceiling of my room. The hairline traces of the 3 broken arms I earned while in elementary school, each a memento of healed fractures clearly visible on x-rays. The screws now in my skull, which airport agents can see each time I walk through security. The headaches, the perpetually thinner hair on the left side of my head, where radiation damaged follicles as it destroyed my tumor. The drooping of my left eyelid as I tire. The new philosophy of scarring. The antibodies we develop after a cold. Our bodies record everything that threatens. Or maybe the body is actually defined by the things that threaten it. We become us by the way we heal from damage. Or better put, we become a new self constantly by stacking on the history of our own injury. We are made in how we struggle against the difficulty of living. We are soft and vulnerable, but somehow resilient, not bouncing back, but forward. Thank you. So I'm unsure, Scott, do we take questions? All right. You in the back.
So I really liked your critique of Tawny O'Dell in this book.
Oh, right, yeah.
And for those of you who don't know her, she has written, one of her books is Backroads, and it was picked up by Oprah, and it's about Northern Appalachia, and it was really a big hit. And so I agree with your critique.
Right.
And I find that people hate me because I have this opinion of her.
Yeah.
And if I understand you, what you're saying is that the portrait that she paints of Northern Appalachia in that book and other books that she's written is just as lopsided as people from outside the region portray us and the people who live here.
Right.
And so what I wondered was this, as a Northern Appalachian writer, do you feel that it is harder for us to get our works published without fulfilling the stereotypes that people expect?
Yes. Yeah, right, so that's it. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that's the problem of that book is that part of what I cite in there. So Tawny O'Dell's from my hometown, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and Tawny O'Dell she's a phenomenal writer. The sentences, particularly in the first half of the book, are just off the charts beautiful, even though they're dark. But in reviewing the book, Oprah describes it as authentic. And that's the problem, I think, with what you're talking about, is that the only way for us to demonstrate our authenticity as Appalachians, or authenticity, quote, authenticity as writers from the region, is to keep writing in the same register that people expect, that we reinforce the stereotypes of degradation. And so when we don't do that, we wind up not being maybe read at all, for one thing, or not being counted as from the region. It's a difficult triangulation, though, because at the same time, you can't ignore the reality and truth. This is the thing that troubles me about that book, is that I see the same thing she sees, even though I think it becomes a totalizing version. So our challenge is how we can authentically actually write about what has happened, what's there, and what maybe we can imagine. I think about Daniel Woodrell, who is Ozarks writer, and I think the Ozarks are sort of cousins to us in so many different ways. And in talking about fiction itself, he says, I've seen enough happen that I imagine what might happen. And for us as writers in the region, I think we have to think about that might. And the might, now Daniel Woodrell's books are pretty dark, so he's not a great example in this direction. But part of our mightness, or our mightiness, is that we have to begin from the place that people think we are and write them towards something else. So that's the longer version of yes. That's a good question. Yeah. And I called Sean Scott, which I think of as a compliment. Scott was the same. Sorry, Sean. There was a hand in the back. Yeah.
Well, then, what do you think of hillbilly elegy?
It's terrible. So it's terrible in two ways, in my assessment. I'm not sure which is more personally offensive. One is it's a terrible memoir. From the art of memoiring, it lacks the fundamental skill of memoir, which is self-reflection. And what we always have to, and I'm always teaching my students about this, when we're writing a memoir, we're not just listing the things that happened to us. We have to triangulate what happened to us with who we are now to make sense of that. And I don't think Vance does that at all. And that's the other part of the problem. What he actually does is comes to that book with a pre-existing notion of what Appalachia is and shapes the memoir that way. So he's actually damaging to us. I mean, we get some attention for it, I suppose, but it's damaging because he's telling everybody, you know what, those hillbillies, they're exactly what you thought they were. And you don't have to think about those stereotypes. So I think he's damaging to our culture in that sense. I'm a little bit less troubled. You know, some call him a fake Appalachian, and I think that's a complicated issue. And he's from Cincinnati, which might as well be part of the region, but isn't. So that part, I'll give him a bit of a pass on. But I think he has a certain political agenda, or certainly the book's been used as a political agenda. So it's a great question. I'm not a fan. I want Ron Howard to make a movie out of my book. Yes?
Sir, have you recovered completely now from your radiation treatment, or will the future be the same? I would hate to see you go through that again.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thanks. I mean, that's actually a very difficult question. The nature of where it's located means they couldn't remove it or even biopsy it, so we don't even exactly know what it is. And so I'm in this perpetual state of flux as we take MRIs every year, and if it doesn't grow, things are good, and if it does, it does. All signs indicate towards stability, so it should be good. And that's part of my trouble with the idea of recovery or reclamation, is that I can never stop thinking about it. I have a line in here that I was joking with the very nice receptionist at the neurosurgeon. Said, oh, well, I guess that's it. I won't have to see you again. She said, you're going to see us every year for the rest of your life. That there's no way to not have those follow-up issues. But I am lucky in that it doesn't appear to be cancerous. It doesn't appear to be spreading. But we'll just see. It could just be lying there dormant. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Another question. I grew up with the word Appalachia, Appalachian, and now it's all Appalachian.
Yeah.
Can you educate me on that?
Yeah. I did too, right? So I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and it was Appalachia, the Appalachian Mountains, with the hard A and the soft CH. And so I went through, my education has gone through cycles. And when I went to graduate school at WVU, I was a little bit older. I was about 30. And I realized, oh, wow, I'm an Appalachian. First of all, I didn't think of myself as being part of the region, and I was pronouncing it wrong. And I totally bought into the claim that if you say Appalachia, you're siding with the outsiders, because that's what they say, especially if you're farther south. That Appalachia, I'm sorry, other way around. If you say Appalachia, you're siding with the outsiders. If you say Appalachia, you're signaling insiders. And for a while, I was determined to do that. But then I realized, like you, that I grew up in Appalachia. And so it's not wrong for me to pronounce my region the way I grew up pronouncing it. And in fact, there have been linguistic studies by Kirk Hazen at WVU that across the region, people pronounce it in so many different ways. Appalachian, Appalachian, I can't do this one, Appalachian, or something. I mean, there's a spectrum, and we have to allow for that variability. Otherwise, we wind up fighting with ourselves about who's legitimately in the region and who's not. So I'm actually trying now to use both. And sometimes I create a distinction between the region and the mountains. Sometimes when I'm talking about north, I want to call it Appalachian. So I don't think you need to apologize for it and re-educate those who are re-educating you. But also, they're not wrong. Everybody's right. That's not true. Yeah, that's a very good question. And actually, I'm not exactly sure. Wheeling is a mixed zone for that, I think. That some people in the Ohio Valley would be much more likely broadly to say Appalachian, and then others would say Appalachian. There's lots of people shaking their head. Okay, they're shaking their head in both ways. So that's exactly my point. Yes?
As a nurse, I found your description of what you're doing with radiation very, I mean, it really helps us. I mean, I was almost in tears because as a nurse, we don't really know what it's like if we haven't gone through it ourselves, and you just put it so well.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, truly, and I was thinking of it constantly from the time I came out of surgery in the intensive care unit on through the treatments, the nursing staff, and actually the entire support staff in the hospital just do not get enough credit, because I think they may not know what it's like, but they understand. And I think there was this one, I don't even know what the role is, they just delivered me Jell-O. That was her job. Like, she was the nutritionist on the floor, and I was always asking for extra Jell-O, and then I wouldn't eat it when I was in the hospital for a week. And she never complained, and she was always friendly. And I think about that as sort of, those were kind of the friendships and the care that push us forward. So thank you. Yes?
At what point did it occur to you that your tumor
Yeah.
had a relationship to Appalachia and
Yeah.
the reclamation?
Right. So I had this thing happen to me, and it was what I was, as a writer, most interested in, was trying to write about my medical recovery. And then the worst thing that could possibly happen to a writer happened. I got a contract to write a book. And it's a great thing. But the book was not to write about medical trauma. The book was to write about what it means to be Northern Appalachian. And I tried, and I was not enjoying it. And I was talking with my father, who taught some geology when he taught high school. And I said, Dad, can you tell me, like, when did the mountains start eroding? And he said, they're not mountains. And he was the one who told me about the plateau, and that unlocked it for me. And so that was the moment where I realized that there was a metaphorical relationship between my landscape and the landscape I grew up in. I rewrote the whole book. I didn't tell my editor, and then I delivered it to him and said, it's a little bit different. And he said, okay. And then he called me. I was sitting in the sun porch, actually in Prince Edward Island, in a farmhouse up there, and he said, that is very different, but I like it. And I think either book would have not worked nearly as well. I'm very happy with what turned out, because it's that idea that we are not separate from our landscapes in some ways, and just the way we treat it poorly, we sometimes treat ourselves poorly. It's about, yeah. I credit my dad. Anybody else? Follow up.
You seem to triangulate an awful lot.
Yeah.
Is that past, present, and future? What are the 3 points of the triangle?
Yeah, well, they're always shifting, for one thing. And I think past, present, future is part of it. And so I was writing this in a pretty difficult cultural moment for America and Appalachia in 2016. Well, that's when I was going through my brain tumor, which was a national crisis. Part of the problem there is a triangulation of past, present, future, and trying to flatten it to a line, right? That past, present, back to past, and that denies a future. So that's one of the triangulation points. Geography also. I'm actually arguing that we need to think about Canada as part of Appalachia, because that's another third point. The rocks go that far. And culturally, the residents of maritime Canada are treated exactly the same way we are. They're thought of in Canada as backwards, as inbred, as stupid, all of those things that you've heard, these stereotypes, the hillbillies of Eastern Canada, and they've also experienced industrial collapse. For them, it's fisheries, some coal mining in Cape Breton, and also forestry. And so that's a new triangulation too. Let's add this third geographical point, so it's not ABC. So yeah, we have to keep shifting those definitions because the lines are fake. And I'm rattling on a little bit here, but it strikes me that my research on the Mason-Dixon line was another thing that helped me think differently about triangulations and redrawing, is that I always thought of the Mason-Dixon line in the context of the Civil War. That the Mason-Dixon line was a separation of North and South, which is true. The Mason-Dixon line, of course, mattering in some way, clearly to West Virginia existing in deciding to nobly secede from the South. But then I realized that the Mason-Dixon line predates America, that the Mason-Dixon line was drawn because of a dispute between Lord Baltimore and William Penn over who got to be taxed at that borderline, of whether it was the Maryland territory or the Pennsylvania territory. So also that, the Mason-Dixon line is a totally artificial delimiter between North and South too. So I'm breaking it all. Sometimes people get annoyed with that too. Like when you're defining Northern Appalachia by saying, let's not think about its definition, can be trouble. If you have any individual questions, I'm happy to come and chat up here, come up and we can chat, or if you want to slink out the back and not make eye contact, that's also absolutely fine. Thanks again to Sean. Thanks to all of you for coming.
Lunch with books. Lunch with books, that's Pepsi, 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 cracks and yells and sings and rocks and swings with more and more. Lunch with books. Lunch with books. At the Ohio County Public Library in Wheeling, West Virginia. It'll make you feel like yoga. Hey, Lordy, Lordy. Mostly on Tuesdays at noon. Bring your lunch, we'll provide the pop. And it's all free. Lunch with books. Knowledge is served.